Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Korer. Today, for our fourth episode of the series, The Philosophy, Science, and Aesthetics of Food, we are joined by Robert T. Valgenti. Robert T. Valgenti was professor of philosophy and the chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Lebanon Valley College. His research and teaching covers contemporary Italian philosophy, hermeneutics, biopolitics, and the philosophy of food. He is also the member of the Menus of Change University Research Collaborative and a desk editor for the journal Gastronomica. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Please check out the links in the description below. Professor Valgenti, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. So sort of before we dive straight into it, could you just tell my audience a little bit more about yourself, your background? How did you get first interested, in philosophy, and then, of course, more specifically in the philosophy of food?
Yeah. So as I always like to say to my students, I didn't choose philosophy. Philosophy chose me. It's one of those things that I guess from a very early age, I had a particular way of thinking and looking at the world. And it really wasn't until I went to college that I would say that I found philosophy. I had always been very interested in mythology and in literature. And certainly my head was in the humanities. And then when I got to college and took my first philosophy course, it was sort of as if the light went on and it was like, oh, there are other people who are thinking in the way that I'm thinking. And that sort of led me down that road. And so I quickly went from there and then was lucky enough to study in a lot of really great places. After I was at the College of the Holy Cross, I was in Italy at the University of Torino studying with Gianni Vattimo right after I had graduated, and then from there went to DePaul University and have been doing philosophy ever since. So it's been an exciting kind of journey, and I guess one that has always run in parallel with my interest in food, but it was a much later development that I started to think those two together. I think, I can remember even as an undergraduate, I remember in particular having one philosophy professor who was also somewhat of a foodie before the term foodie existed. And we would host dinners with some of the students, and we'd find things to make. And I was always someone who was interested in cooking, and I kept a garden from a rather early age. So nice. So it was something that was always in my mind. But even then, I was not thinking, philosophy and food as these two things that could possibly go together. And it wasn't until I think as I was finishing up my PhD and I was teaching some introductory courses, I sort of had the notion that maybe food is a good way to get students not so much interested in philosophy, but maybe to break down some of the fears that students oftentimes have when they first study philosophy. They think, maybe it's too abstract or it's too obscure, it's going to be too difficult in some way. So I thought about, if I were sitting at a dinner table, how could I use the things that are there at the table to introduce some of the fundamental concepts of philosophy? And I think one of the real starting points was the issue of taste. So you can immediately begin to talk about the sort of pair of what is singular versus what is universal when you think about something like taste, because taste is something that's absolutely unique to each of us. We all have our particular tastes in a way, but we also all have this capacity to taste things, except in extreme or cases. But we all have our likes, we all have our dislikes, and this is something that we all share in a way. So taste is this phenomenon that is both singular and universal at the same time. And this is a way to begin. And I found with many students who were just reading philosophy for the first time, it was difficult for them to talk about abstract ideas or universal ideas, but they were very willing to talk about the things that they liked. And so if you could start with taste, if you can start with that and then make the move to the philosophical move, which is always, I think, a move of abstraction and a move towards the universal. I would kind of, I like to resist the universal in a way, but at the same time, there's a directionality in the kind of thinking that philosophy does that is always towards the more abstract. So that's sort of how those two came together. And then from that introductory course, I think I wrote a paper and had submitted it to a food studies conference. And then at the first food studies conference that I ever went to, I sort of fell in with a great group of students and scholars from New York University in the food studies program there. And they were really interested in on the theoretical side of food studies. So it was sort of like that sort of launched everything and then got me going in that direction and thinking both that I could write philosophically about food, and at that time was starting to read Carolyn Korsmeyer and Lisa Heldke, finding that there are others who were doing this. But then also, taking on this sort of ridiculous life of having two absolutely distinct research agendas, which I still haven't been able to reconcile completely, because I have this one life where I work on contemporary Italian philosophy and hermeneutics, and then this other life where I'm working on food and philosophy. And I've been trying to, there are places where they crisscross a little bit, but I still find myself having to split my time.
No, that's awesome. And sort of, usually when people might be, having sort of an introductory course to philosophy, one of the first things that usually pops up is sort of talking about the good life. So going back to the Greeks usually. And, that's actually one sort of angle that you also discuss. Okay, let's think about the good life. And then through that question, we can sort of consider what is really at stake when we talk and think about the philosophy of food. So could you maybe help us understand, how could that question help us sort of consider what's really important in the philosophy of food?
Right. I mean, it's always a great place to start in an introductory class, because it's sort of where Western philosophy begins. So you're going to be in that space anyway. But it's also one of those questions when you put it to students, it's not a way that we talk about our lives generally, right? We don't go around asking each other, what is the good life? Generally, it's more, what would you like to do with your life? What do you want your career to be? Or what kind of things do you do for pleasure? And we tend to separate those things. So the first move that's really powerful is that taking that philosophical question of what is the good life, you're already beginning it with this holistic approach, I would say. So that's a good starter to start just thinking in that way. I think that undoes perhaps a lot of the sort of problematic things that students sometimes get that are overly career driven rather than being exploratory with their education in some way. Mm-hmm. But it's also a question that when you just start to scratch, below the surface a little bit, I think students very quickly realize that the question is a lot more complex than it lets on when we start to talk about the good as distinct from what we find pleasurable, my individual good versus the shared good or the goods of others that might be really hostile to my own notion of the good. So you immediately open up all the questions of philosophy. So when I ask, how do I want to live my life and what do I want to be? That's an ontological question. When I ask about the good life and how my good life coexists with others and their notions of the good life, that's the ethical question. When we talk about pleasure and what I find pleasing, we get into the aesthetic question. So it's really powerful in that way to get the ball rolling. And then of course, when we talk about the good life, all of those aspects, of these philosophical questions, the aesthetic and the ontological and the ethical, food is intertwined with all of them, right? Because food is never just eating. It's always something that immediately ties us to other individuals and other beings and other systems within the world in ways that are complex, massive, and difficult oftentimes to reconcile. They don't reconcile out neatly too. So it's great for philosophy. I always like to say this, paradoxes are a great place to begin our philosophical investigation, because you've immediately lowered the bar. We're not resolving this. We're just trying, we're not going to untangle this knot. We're just trying to appreciate how tangled it is. And that in and of itself can be really valuable work.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think also, when I was reading this, it's a great sort of your orienting question. Like it helps you orient yourself sort of and see the landscape. And then, of course, you have to dig deeper. But I think this is very helpful to have this question sort of in the back of our minds.
Yeah, and or I would say even in the front of our minds, it's, for all of the insistence, especially in the United States, so much emphasis is placed on what is going to be practical, like within an education for job training, or what's going to return the value of the investment in education. So in the United States, where we pay a lot for our educational system, where students pay a lot for their educational system compared to the rest of the world, the idea of return on investment is really central. It's that I see that as one problem built upon another problem. But given that that's where we live, asking the question of what is the good life is also a really practical question. I mean, the Greeks were already on to the work-life balance issues, and that holistic approach is really important. So I don't see it just as this idle philosophical question. It's a question that everyone should be asking themselves at every step along the way. So when we talk about trying to cultivate lifelong learners in an educational environment, that question is central to that, how to live the good life. Because if you understand that question, to a full extent, you understand that it operates like this key to all of the other smaller issues that we grapple with in the day-to-day. So that's where I think the philosophical question is immediately a practical question, is immediately a question that has real relevance in day-to-day life.
Yeah, no, certainly. And sort of thinking back about some of the episodes that we had so far, a lot of the conversations we started with also understanding sort of, the history and how that relates, the history of philosophy and how that sort of relates to the philosophy of food. And, we've been starting out a lot with Aristotle and Plato, and then understanding also why there has sort of been this looking down upon the philosophy of food, or not taking it serious, not worthy of sort of, deep philosophical consideration. And, of course, they also raised the question about the good life. Maybe help us understand, what they said sort of about food and how it related for them to sort of the good life.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a certain way, it's what weren't they saying about it? There are other scholars who've done some pretty good work. I'm thinking of someone like Ileana Szymanski, who wrote a little bit an essay on sort of how food is operating underneath the surface in some of those Platonic dialogues. We can think about how. Like in the symposium, for example, the backdrop is this party, it's, and there's food and there's drink. And so, I mean, the Greeks, this was a central part of their life, right? You could also think, I'm thinking of back eons ago when I was reading Walter Burgert's book on Greek religion and all the cultic rituals that were going on in the Greek world, and how many of them involved some kind of food offering, some kind of food that's there. So it's there, but I think the trajectory, particularly coming out of Socrates and more importantly Plato, is one that places greater importance upon the life of the soul rather than the life of the body. And then the life of the body is one that distracts us from the life of the soul. So if eating and the pleasures of food are tied to the body, or tied to what is immediate and transient and therefore not eternal or universal or unchanging, then, so this is kind of, from Parmenides forward, that desire for permanence and stability and unity is something that the transience and the variety of food in those types of experience are going to threaten in some way. So it gets sort of caught up, we might say, in that kind of dualism between the mind on the one hand and or the soul on the one hand and the body on the other. And that's something that's not unique to Greek philosophy either. We see it pop up either somewhere down the road and and the Christian theology that derives from it, but also in other traditions in the world where the things of this life and the desires of this life needed to be treated in a secondary sort of way, or as problematic distractions from a kind of life of the soul or enlightenment or something like that. So it's not an uncommon one. I don't know of, it would be interesting to think about that question in relation to issues of abundance and lack, and the degree to which the precarity of one's food system, influences the kinds of ideas and philosophies that flow from it. We certainly know that philosophy itself evolves, at least in the Greek world, with a society that can support a small class of individuals who can spend their time just thinking.
Yeah.
Everyone is not hands-on doing just the practical tasks of the day to day. So that's work that I don't know about. I don't even know if that's there, but it would be interesting to kind of see how the shape of societies, or what kinds of material conditions are shaping those early ideologies, and how they're connected to either the security or the instability of food availability or food systems that might be there. Or there might be no connection there. It might be completely unrelated.
I see.
Too. But perhaps things get a little bit better with Aristotle. I'm always a little bit shaky on Aristotle, so I'm gonna leave that to the experts. But it's certainly, and others like Korsmeyer have commented on this. It's certainly a thread within the history of Western philosophy, that the proximate senses of smell and touch and taste get downplayed, whereas the distal senses of hearing and sight, those seem to inform all of the metaphors that are connected to thinking and this kind of apprehension from a distance and objectivity purported objectivity that comes with them, seem to be really central. And it's not really until much later in the history of Western philosophy that we start to get some strong challenges to that way of thinking.
No, for sure. Yeah. So no, I think that backdrop is like quite useful, and then centuries go by, and then we can sort of discuss another philosopher that we didn't discuss so far, in this series, namely Nietzsche. So one question that you ask, and that's sort of in the context of what we just sort of discussed, right, with the Greek philosophers, not necessarily taking philosophy of food, completely serious, although of course it was there as well, as you just explained. But then you raised the question, right? How can food be redeemed? And you think Nietzsche sort of does just that, and I quote here because I like this quote from you, where you say, if one desires a crucial moment in the history of philosophy when food is redeemed, everything changes with Nietzsche. The question of the good life, the status of food and diet, everything. So that's quite a claim, I guess. So if you could just introduce sort of what Nietzsche does, right, how he redeems food, that would be amazing.
Right. And so, I mean, at least as far as we know, like, if the thesis about the sort of importance of the mind over the body throughout the history of philosophy is true, it's certainly possible there were lots of interesting things that were written that never saw the light of day. But we'll go with Nietzsche because, and I would say this, beyond the philosophy of food as well. I mean, for me, Nietzsche is this incredibly important thinker. Because if we look at the long arc of Western philosophy, and as I had mentioned, if that sort of if the importance of universality and permanence and unity, kind of emerged from Parmenides, the stability of being is sort of what drives a good deal of Western philosophy from its beginnings up to this point. It's sort of Nietzsche who says, hey, what about Heraclitus? What about transience? What about movement? What about, flux? And so what we find in Nietzsche is then this kind of, so maybe the way I would put it is like this. If the focus on the soul is an attempt to find that stable and permanent and everlasting element at the core of our identity that makes us who we are, maybe it's Nietzsche who starts to think of us as, an alimentary canal with arms and legs and eyes and all sorts of other appendages and organs, because the world is constantly passing through us. And so we're never the same. In fact, we're this channel, we're this point of passage that is constantly processing and metabolizing the world around it, taking matter and turning it into energy. It's taking in toxins and pathogens and defeating some of them and succumbing to others. But it becomes a very different way of thinking of yourself if you think of yourself as a point of passage for the material of the world. so that things are constantly going through. So you are not this stable entity. Your being is constantly being transformed, and you play a role in that too, because you are to some extent as an omnivore choosing the kinds of things hopefully that you can eat, or there's will involved there also. And of course the rest of being a human, which is much more than just eating, is also your social interactions and the span of your life. And throughout that time too, you are making decisions that have intended and unintended consequences about what you will eventually become. So when I say that Nietzsche redeems food in a way, I would say as a philosophical topic, it's all of a sudden being brought to the fore as something that we need to take really seriously. And the way that I sometimes present this in class is, if we think about what a philosophy of food might be, I don't know if Nietzsche has a philosophy of food, but certainly food and alimentation seem to be central, both metaphorically and beyond metaphor in his work. But if we think about how we maybe would put together or conduct a philosophy of food in some way, what we want to think is that if it's true that throughout the history of Western philosophy, the focus on the distal senses of hearing and sight and the downplaying of the proximate senses like taste and smell and touch have shaped Western thinking down to the core of the language and the metaphors that are used and the concepts that are engaged, then if we all of a sudden kind of reinsert food and taste and those more proximal senses into the mix, that should have some kind of reciprocal impact on our thinking. So if we've only been using 2/5 of the senses as a kind of filter for our language and our concepts, what happens when we activate those other three? What happens when we start to use food not just as an object that's out there that we can in some way quantify and apprehend and conceptualize, but that we think through food, so that the encounter with food, which has been ignored by philosophy to some extent up to this point, is now influencing our very interpretation or our reinterpretations of concepts like knowledge and being and all the central concepts of philosophy. If we've been ignoring a big chunk of the human experience up to that point, becoming aware of that and bringing that into the conversation should have a transformative impact on philosophy. And I think Nietzsche, to some extent, initiates that because he's, I think when I had written a piece on Nietzsche's use or thinking about food, and this was one where I literally spent a summer and I was just basically rereading all of Nietzsche and just looking for every food reference I could find, everything about the stomach, everything about alimentation, everything about taste. And you find that, it's one of those moments where you think it's everywhere. And he's constantly thinking about this. And he's not just thinking, oh, this is like what happens when you metabolize food. He's talking about metabolizing moral ideas from the history of philosophy in the way that we metabolize food. We consume it, we transform it, and it's so that it's no longer recognizable and that it gives us some energy and that gets transferred into the reformulation. So when he talks about in the genealogy of morality, the revaluation of all values, this is in many ways a kind of metabolization of values. We're still talking about value. We're not escaping value. We're just kind of dismantling and reincorporating those values into new values. They're becoming something that's different, and they're becoming food as well. So that the food, that the morals that we ate, they'll become new morals because this is just the way that humans are in some sense. And so our ideas are going to be food for the next generation, just as our bodies are food for whatever perhaps awaits us in some peaceful or not so pleasant future. So,
and just to pick up on sort of these two distinct ways of putting it, I guess one is sort of more the metaphorical side of things, and the other is more sort of the literal side of things, right? So, I mean, in this article where you discuss sort of Nietzsche and food, you also talk about, his personal life and him dealing with, the diet in a very concrete, real sort of literal sense, I guess. And then the more metaphorical side, if I remember correctly, talking about like digestion and sort of, comparing that with a sense of understanding, right? Reaching certain level of understanding. So how do we sort of pull these things apart, or like, do we, make them sort of directly connect, or should we just understand them as two distinct things, or how should we go about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm certainly skeptical of the view that would say, oh, well, that's just a metaphor, and that we have other better, more objective or accurate ways of talking about things. I'd like to really, push those two ideas closely together. I mean, a lot of the sort of trajectory I work out of philosophically out of hermeneutics, is, particularly in Vattimo's philosophy, where he would make the argument that everything is linguisticality, to use Gadamer's term, Sprachlichkeit. It's basically language all the way down. And so we don't have being without language. And this is, for some, perhaps too kind of anthropocentric of a view of philosophy. But there's a way in which we can't, I think, just simply say that there's a kind of language, whether it's scientific or it's analytic, philosophical language, that gets to the thing objectively, and then there's this other more kind of poetic language. At the core, it's all metaphor, right? And we understand that at the core of any metaphor is this more literal notion. I always think of, I think it's from Animal Crackers. Maybe I'm misquoting, but Groucho Marx has this great line where someone says, "What are you, a man or a mouse?" He uses this kind of metaphoric description of questioning his manhood, and he says, "Throw me a piece of cheese and you'll find out." And he, as a joke, immediately just kind of dismantles the metaphor and exposes the literality at the core of it. That the metaphor can be taken in a literal way as well. And so our language works. The symbolic power of language is one that's tied to metaphor. So. I also think, so Graham Harman, the philosopher, the founder of object-oriented ontology, one of his more recent books, he has a chapter on metaphor that I think is one of the best treatments of the subject I've read in a very, very long time. So I would recommend that people take a look at that. That's one of those things that maybe I can give you. You can put it in the
for sure,
somewhere or something. And but it's such a great treatment of metaphor. And even though I have some disagreements with object-oriented ontology on certain issues, I think on metaphor he's absolutely spot on, and that we shouldn't draw that kind of strict distinction, that metaphor is operative in all of the language that we use.
I see. And then when we sort of again take these questions that sort of Nietzsche raises, both literal and metaphorical, and sort of think about it in the context of him sort of radically overturning maybe traditional values or Christian values or Christian morality. How do we make that work? I mean, there's this transformation, as you mentioned, right? Like this redefining or questioning all values, but that sort of maybe sets the project, or at least that's how it feels like for me. That sets the project, but then like still, what's the direction that we're taking by?
Yeah, this is a question that's really central to my work. I'd say both within the realm of the philosophy of food, but more broadly in philosophical hermeneutics, is that, philosophical hermeneutics and other strands in postmodern thinking, now we talk about fake news and the absence of truth and all of these sort of issues within our social and political world. But postmodern philosophy has sort of Nietzsche beat everyone to the punch on this, right? So once we move into the realm of anti-foundational thinking, once we get to a place where to nihilism, to a point where there are no absolute foundations for any of the truths that we have, and so whether we want to think of that in the kind of strand coming through Nietzsche and others, or we want to think even in terms of someone like late Wittgenstein, and the idea of language games, we have the idea that what we take for our rock solid reality is one that is always filtered through language, and that language is changeable, and therefore the foundations for our truth claims are not as solid as they are. So as we know all too well today and throughout history, leaning on an absolute truth or claiming an absolute truth, that has caused lots of problems throughout history. In fact, you had mentioned, I think when we were setting up the discussion today, that you have a series on Kant, and so I've written my dissertation on Kant. So, and one of the things I always find fascinating about Kant is what's motivating Kant's critical project, and his theoretical project is really motivated by sort of political ideas. He sees that Europe has been consumed by these religious wars for centuries. And how do you resolve that problem? How do you resolve the problem of dogmatic and absolute claims to truth? And I think in many ways, the Critique of Pure Reason is this sort of initial step towards anti-foundational thinking, particularly within the transcendental deduction. Like there, he's sort of creating a foundation that's this very bizarre sort of foundation that doesn't have a rock solid core. The way that I always like to describe that is, we think of a place like Kansai International Airport in Japan, a very seismic place. So think of modern airports. They're usually steel and glass. They look like an ice cube tray, basically. And of course, that would be disastrous during an earthquake or some kind of seismic event, because there'd be twisting and ice cubes would be popping everywhere. And so that airport is a great example where what they've done is it's like any building, it needs solid foundations. But the foundations that they built are actually built upon an incredibly sophisticated hydraulic system that monitors the seismic activity and shifts, by millimeters, the foundation to compensate for those shifts to keep it. So the idea of your solid foundation is actually one that is constantly engaged with, interpreting, and transforming based on the conditions that are going on around it. I think that's the way that we have to think about the idea that there's no absolute truth. The idea that there's no absolute truth doesn't lead to anarchy or chaos. I actually think that the claim that there are no absolute truths is an ethical challenge that's been issued by Nietzsche to us. And so this is where the connection to food is really important. So if the challenge to us is there are no absolute truths, but we still need to figure out how to live together. Dogmatic truths have led to all sorts of horrible things happening throughout the history of humanity. What we're learning in the past century and a half is that not having absolute truths is also really challenging and tricky, and can lead to some, and the verdict is perhaps out is what is ultimately better for us. But I want to, I think it's worth the proof is in the pudding for dogmatic truths. I think we're still within the learning phase of trying to figure out how to coexist in a global. So we've had two counter movements going on. At the same time that we've sort of exploded the notion of an absolute truth, and truth has become fractured and plural, we've also essentially shrunken the size of the globe so that we've got more contact with more people all of the time. So the world becomes both more manageable and more chaotic and confusing at the same time. And that's the challenge of what it means to live now in the 21st century. And so I think this is a great task this is why we need philosophy, is because it's not a simple and an easy solution. And we need to think through how, my claim to truth resonates and has impacts on all of those others who also have a right to their claim to truth, and a right, and as even someone like Kant would tell us, if we're going to resist the dogmatic claim to truth and the absolute claim to truth, what does it mean then to engage in some kind of critical dialogue that allows us to talk about what truths are, how they operate, and how we might best coexist as a society? As a global society. And so food becomes really important there, because once again, I'll kind of invoke a paradox. The paradox of the global food system that we're all a part of now is that when I eat, an orange that came from Spain, or I eat, some dumplings that were made in Taiwan, or what have you, or so much of the food that we get that's coming from around the globe, and even food that's somewhat local too. I am in contact with more people than probably any humans have been in the history of humanity, right? So if you think of a global food, like how many people from, a coffee bean being picked on a mountainside in Colombia, arriving in my cup as I grind it and brew it in my house, how many people are involved along the way directly, let alone indirectly, because of all the impacts of agriculture and transportation and all those kinds of things. So we're more connected than ever before. But the degree of those connections are smaller and smaller. So that ethical question emerges because all of those other people who are involved in this process of sustaining me and bringing me food, and all those people who are involved in this food chain and get a living because individuals like me are engaged in this food system and purchasing food, the degree of those connections is lesser. So it becomes much, much more challenging to view those individuals, as ethical beings worthy of our respect, because they just become numbers lost in that chain. People will talk about the experience of going to a farmer's market and say, oh, it was great because I met the farmer, I talked to them about what they grew, and now I feel like I've got this 1 or 2 step, connection to the people who put food in my body. And that's really, and people understand the importance of that. The following sentence always has to be, if we recognize how important that direct connection is, when we're at the end of all of these indirect and distant connections, how do we treat that farmer across the globe with the same respect and the same care and the same equality that we treat the farmer who we just had the conversation with? It's a much greater challenge because it is so diffused and dispersed within that massive global system. So that's, making, humanizing, let's say, that global system is a real challenge for ethics, because it's hard to understand how my actions are going to impact all of those others along the way.
No, that's very fascinating, and that also reminds me of part of our discussion with Lisa Heldke when she also emphasized in one of her books sort of this interdependence, right? Like I think that sort of then sort of set against this idea of pure autonomy, right? Which might also have, I guess, some ethical sort of considerations built into that. But so on the one hand, there's this interdependentness that we even realize, but then still sort of extending that moral circle, as some people would like to put it, is sort of still the challenge, because that interdependentness is manifested in a very thin manner in sort of a phenomenological sense, I guess.
Absolutely.
No, that's very fascinating, and certainly a challenge, I think. And then maybe shifting to talking about maxims, which I like. You introduce sort of a Nietzschean maxim in the context of 2 other thinkers that you mention of the 19th century. So first of all, you mentioned Feuerbach and the maxims about food and eating. So Feuerbach states, and I quote, "You are what you eat." That you mention Brillat-Savarin maxim saying, "Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are." And then you sort of introduce in this context of talking about maxims, and thereby summarizing Nietzsche's meditations on digestion by formulating the maxim, and I quote, "How to become what you eat." So how are we supposed to understand Nietzsche's maxim, and maybe how does it contrast with these 2 other maxims that we have?
Yeah, so I mean, and these are expressions that we hear in all sorts of ways, right? It's you are what you eat. To think it's rare that a philosopher coins something that becomes kind of common idiom in America, in American culture. It's absolutely fascinating in that way alone. But I think so on the one hand, I mean, certainly Feuerbach's maxim and Savarin's maxim, those are open to various interpretations, right? They're broad enough. But I would say that they fall pretty squarely within the tradition, the Western philosophical tradition, in the sense that we're thinking of being in this sort of additive way, right? Like that you pick up these qualities from the things that you eat, and they shape who you are. And we can think of that in terms of kind of material things that we take in, but also the kinds of, the kind of practices and care you go about. And, but, the idea is like, you do all this stuff and that's what you're going to become. Mm-hmm. And I think what Nietzsche does, and this is that, once again, that Heraclitean trajectory, Nietzsche is thinking about, this idea of how to become what you eat, is that it's this ongoing process of transformation. So it's, once again, that as we eat and as we transform, it's not as if we're becoming this thing. It's that who we are is always, just over the horizon and unable to know. And then once you catch up with that, you've already eaten that thing, and then you're on to the next thing. So I mean, and that it's a riff on, what's there, I think, at the beginning of Nietzsche's Ecce Homo, his autobiographical work, how to become who you truly are, is kind of what he says at the beginning of that work. And so, and if we're always caught in this process of becoming, then the truth of who you are is something that can never really, you can never really put your finger on. It's always, that Heraclitean stream that keeps flowing by, and that we can never step into twice.
Mm-hmm. And staying sort of in the realm of ethics or ethical notions. So this was very surprising to me when I was reading this, where you sort of try to ground the idea or the notion of equality in our sense of taste, right? So, usually maybe that sort of idea, with human rights, or grounded in, our reason or rationality, etc. But, in taste. And then, I will read another quote that I like. So, sorry for doing this again, but like you mentioned, you argue like to give voice to our taste is to defend life itself, to defend the right that any of us has to a life, based not on an abstract notion of universality, but on the unique qualities of our particular life experiences. So that seems quite like a daring claim, I guess, to sort of ground this idea of equality. So yeah, how do you think about that, and why do you think this works maybe even better than, again, these other sort of directions that many people have taken?
Yeah, it certainly has a sense. I have to live by my words now. It's always nudging towards a sort of manifesto of taste, as perhaps, or as sort of how I'd like to see it. And in all honesty, it's one of the ideas that frustrates me and keeps me coming back to this problem. And so I'm trying to figure it out, I think, in a way. And so there are a couple of motivations at work here. I think one of the motivations is sort of what I mentioned earlier about how I go about teaching a philosophy of food course, and starting with taste. Mm-hmm. And this is the idea that, to think of the life of the mind as one that's inclusive and one that is not separated from the body. This means that anyone can start from any point, and what is your entry point is your preferences and what you like, and what tastes good to you. Now, this is already really tricky, because if we say, yeah, it's individual, it's exactly what I do. But we know, like, you had Carolyn Korsmeyer on, and we know from Carolyn Korsmeyer's work that number one, that taste isn't just completely individual, that we also acquire tastes, and our tastes change over time. And the food that's fed to us early on is going to shape what our tastes are. There are lots of factors that go into it that are cultural. And then there's also the biological and the physiological side, that the sheer number of taste receptors that I have on my tongue are going to have some impact on whether I have a sort of preference for bitter things or sweet things. And then all of that gets wrapped up in an experience that is never just the physical act of tasting. It's always also at the same time a cognitive act. That taste delves into our store of memories. It activates our cognitive apparatus. And so you can even go back to Aristotle here, in De Anima, where he's talking about the senses. And we understand that the senses are never just kind of simply working in isolation in this physiological realm, but that the mind is always co-involved with it. So immediately we find that what starts off as a kind of, easy access point for everyone quickly challenges us with some questions that I think are important and that we need to reckon with. So immediately what I thought was my taste, oh, wait, other people have the same taste, or I picked that up from society, or, what does it mean to like coffee, this product that comes from somewhere else on the globe that's not, indigenous to the country where I grew up, and on that. So automatically I'm now connected to others. Yeah. And that at least starts a conversation in some way. I think there's another way of approaching it, which is, we hear, I think, a lot of activism around food security. We'll talk about the basic human right not being sustenance, but the enjoyment of food. That what makes us truly human is not that, not that we can sustain ourselves through an omnivorous diet, but that we find enjoyment, and that food is central to our cultural lives and our cultural identities. And so I think taste is a part of that, because taste is not just, this tastes good to me, but taste is also one of the ways that I activate my engagement with my culture and my community. When I taste something and it tastes like home, or it tastes like, the festival or the ritual that I had taken part in some way. So food activates it in that way. So to be fully human, and to I think to appreciate and to respect the rights that human beings have, means that you have to create the conditions, not just for the presence of food that will sustain someone, but for the enjoyment of food. And taste, I think, is central to that in some way. Maybe the last idea that's there in this notion of taste is, if everyone has their own tastes or preferences, and and I'll expand that a little bit, because we can, there can certainly be cases where someone has no sense of taste, either because of the physiological sense of taste, either because of some kind of physiological issue, or we know that we can have a cold and not be able to taste and smell things as well. But if we think of taste not just as that physiological sense, but also preferences and our memories around food and the experience of food, which could also involve textures and smells and all of that. So if that is something that everyone has a right to, and it is a part of everyone's life, it is something that no one else can tell you. I can't tell you that, if you say, well, my favorite flavor of ice cream is chocolate, I say, no, it isn't. This would be ridiculous. I can't tell you what your preferences are. Maybe that is what gives everyone a seat at the table. And so when we think about what it means to coexist, and what it means, most importantly, to be open to, and to give space for, and to respect equally the voice of others that we want to include at the table, who have been excluded from the table, historically. It means that what allows someone to be at that table is simply that they have preferences which guide them. And that's it. And that seems, a kind of, not I wouldn't call it a low bar. It seems that it's a bar that could lead us to all sorts of problems of subjectivism. But that's exactly the challenge that we need. That the problem of coexistence is not the people who have the same tastes as us. The problem of coexistence are the ones who have tastes that challenge us. And what does it mean to say your tastes mean that you sit at this table and we talk about the things we like and we dislike? And we already have good practice for this, right? To just sit down, so when I do an exercise with my students and we do a tasting, whether it's cheese or, it's different types of sauces or what have you, when we taste, or we get a set of spices and talk about things we recognize and don't recognize, if we're able to do that, this very basic idea of, even when you talk to little kids, what do you like? What do you not like? Why do you like that? Why do you not like that? That is practice for the more difficult discussion. So we think, how can we resolve these issues? It's like, no, we've practiced this. We know how to do this. And move forward, understanding, that you can't just simply dismiss someone else's taste. Whether that's their taste for a certain type of food that they like, or it's an idea that they hold about how they should live their own lives. I think that's sort of the space where I think there's some challenging ethical and political work to be done in philosophy.
No, that's really helpful. And I'm still having sort of a few worries, I guess, that maybe staying in sort of the terminology that you use, because that I really like. So when you talk about, for example, getting a seat at the table, right? For me, that sounds sort of like a good first step, right? Like if you want to sort of enter into ethical discourse, okay, at least we should all have, our voices be heard, right? But then, and that sort of emphasizes this idea of connectedness, right? Like we're all connected in that way, and we all have our unique sort of individual voice. But then sort of the worry, I guess, like that seemed to appear is sort of, right, the issue of conflict. When conflict does actually appear, and you acknowledge that, right, then, what do we do then? And this reminds me, in my conversation with Charles Spence, for example, he uses the words like different taste worlds, right? And then the question becomes sort of, what is our common coin, right? Like, what are we exchanging? So, here maybe like, a Kantian or someone else might say, we're exchanging reasons, and reasons is the primitive, right? That we all understand. So how do we create sort of that way of at least being able to communicate this with each other? Like, what's the primitive that would be, in this case, sort of put forward?
Yeah, this is where maybe I would disagree with that notion of a common currency. I think the power of starting with taste is starting with that is like I can never have your taste. So when if we take let's take a hamburger. I'll slice it down the middle, and I give you half. Hopefully, I don't know if you're vegetarian or not, but if I give you half and I take half, or whatever food it is, and we both eat it, I can't experience your taste. Mm-hmm. So rather than saying, what's the common starting point in the sense of what's, how, like, it's as if you're asking from the very beginning, how are we going to resolve this, rather than how am I going to listen to what is absolutely other from me? I think that first step is really important, because if I begin, and I would call this the anti-foundational step, I would call this the nihilistic step, that if I begin with this idea that I can never taste in the way that you do, then everything after that is always going to be an approximation, a compromise, and that might just be the best that we can do. And so we don't seek perfection at that point. We don't seek absolute resolution. It's that we're always going to be juggling, and it's always going to feel like there's one more flaming torch in the air than we can handle when we're trying to juggle this. That is the real challenge of coexistence. If we can resolve it real simply, and Pat, that's when I'm the most worried. That's when it seems like that person never even got to the table.
I see.
To ask their question, because it seems that it's far too quiet. And I don't mean to be dismissive in this way, because we've all been there. Guilty as charged, right? We've all had the dinner guest at our table that we're just like, oh God, who is this person, and when are they leaving? Or how do I handle this really awkward situation? Or, in the social and political realm, what do I do with ideas that are not just absolutely morally abhorrent to my own views, but maybe threatening to the entire project that I'm proposing, right? So if the general project that many people might be on with this kind of openness towards the other, allowing everyone to have their voice heard in some way, what do we do with the individual? And this is not a new question for me, but what do we do with that individual who believes that it's their way or the highway, or dogmatically says that, whether it comes from God or from nature or from wherever, like, this is the one truth, this is the way it's got to be, and everything that's against this is a problem. That person's going to sit at the table. That person isn't even going to recognize that their view is a taste. They're going to believe that it's a truth. So how do you get that individual on board? Or should I try to get that individual on board? Should I, this is something I haven't fully resolved yet. This is one of the challenges. So let's say, for example, if you're sitting at my table and you believe in X as an absolute truth, some divine being says this is the way it's going to be, and that's it. And if I say, well, all of us at this table have our own views, and all those views are like taste, and you say, wait a second, it's not a taste. This is the word of my God. This is an absolute truth. It's not my truth. It's the truth. So immediately when I engage you in my ethical worldview, from your perspective, it might seem that I am being dismissive of your truth. And that's something that I might disagree with, but I have to reckon with it at some level. Like they're, you know, in this, you know, we can kick it back into the food metaphors, right? Like there are lots of things that I can taste. There are lots of things that I can, but there are certain things that are absolutely going to kill me. There are certain things that are going to be absolutely bad for my body in a very measurable way. And there's no sort of getting around that. And the real question is, are there those things in our moral and our political lives, or are our moral and political values always more like those individual tastes, always, you know, as Nietzsche would put it, those values that we are constantly taking in and metabolizing that transform us, but aren't necessarily absolutely destructive to ourselves or to our project.
And does this also have implications sort of for like is taste here taken to be sort of the human sense of taste, right? Or can we take this idea of taste that we put forward to sort of defend this idea of equality like beyond like human taste?
Yeah, yeah. So this is the necessary place where this way of thinking has to go. And you know, so we already recognize this, right? Our social lives, we give our pets a place at the table oftentimes, and we know that they have preferences for certain things over others. You know, and I don't want to, you know, it's a good question. I think a question you asked before is like this idea of notion of taste and how it's driving. Is it metaphorical, or is it, you know, is it kind of more material? And it's sort of in that, you know, it's neither but both at the same time. But certainly what you know, our interactions with animals teach us that you know, oftentimes we allow people at the table, but we want them there just to be consumed. Yeah, they don't have a voice at that table. They're there, but they're there to do some work for us, whether it's to fuel our bodies or in other ways. And we can talk about plant life in that way too. And you know, the way forward here, I mean, this could immediately become a problematic project if it isn't already problematic enough. And then I automatically could, you know, will sound hypocritical too, as someone who is not a vegetarian. But will willingly concede all the times that the arguments for vegetarianism are far better than the ones for carnivorism. But once again, it's tricky. And I think the way forward is never as neat as we would like to draw out philosophically on some kind of conceptual map. These things you know, run over into each other in challenging ways. So I think a starting point then is, you know, is always this notion of kind of proceeding with caution, like to start, you know, it's the way actually I read Kant in the categorical imperative. I tend to think that, I hope I'm not offending you or any. I know I'll offend other Kantians out there, but you know, I don't think Kant was so foolish as to think that the categorical imperative was this kind of absolute, and that we had to sort of be, you know, use that algorithm to program our lives. I mean, I like to think of Kant as the great host of dinner parties, which he absolutely was and enjoyed doing. And it seems that, you know, this is an idea I get from Gianni Battimo, but it's this idea of thinking of these categorical imperatives more in lines of Kant's notion of the regulative ideal, that it's about a kind of movement. And what we're trying to do is we use that concept as a kind of waypoint off in the distance. And our goal is to move closer to that, to move in that direction, to orient ourselves in that way. And so, you know, to be open towards the other in that way, and that can be both our human others and our animal others. You know, those are the first steps that we need to take. And certainly, if we take those steps, if we open ourselves more to the other, if we stay on guard for those kind of dogmatic and absolute truth claims, that is already going to put us into a new position in that very Nietzschean sense. You know, so to just live in a way where we're sort of hyper alert about our dogmatic claims, and we're trying to always be on this way towards becoming ever more open towards otherness, we move a couple steps ahead, things are going to look different to us.
I
Things
see.
are going to change.
Yeah.
Your new issues will arise, and so if I were to put myself into a kind of categorization of philosophers, I always like to think of myself. I come out of the background of philosophical hermeneutics. I wrote my dissertation on Kant and his influence on some 20th century philosophers, but really, I just say I fall into the kind of trajectory of critical thought in that Kantian sense. How do we create a sort of conceptual system, or how do we interact with our concepts? If we understand that the job of a philosopher is to understand the way that concepts shape our thinking and shape our interactions with others, how the life of the mind is not just stuck in the life of the mind, but it actually runs through our encounters with all of material existence all of the time. So our world is co-constituted by our mind and by the physical reality that's out there. So in that way, I'm a constructivist like Kant. And so if we move forward in that way, then what critical thinking is in the Kantian sense, or what critique is in the Kantian sense, is to constantly be surveying those foundations of that system to make sure that you're not falling into dogmatic ideas and that you've got a kind of openness. That's he uses that metaphor, right? So at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, when he talks about essentially surveying we thought we were going to build this edifice to the heavens of critical thinking, but now we're just left with these pieces, these ruins. And he's like, our task is to kind of walk among these pieces. And when you think of them even as puzzle pieces that don't necessarily fit together perfectly, but that still function with us. This is the history that we carry forward, our own personal histories and our kind of shared cultural history. And so we need to develop our facilities to navigate it in some way. And to kind of bring this, it's taking us afield from food a little bit, but to kind of think of us in that way. I always think that food is one of those elements. We just look at a menu at a fast food restaurant today, even though those might be contentious places. What we see at many fast food restaurants is a kind of distilled form of kind of global, various cultures from around the world in this kind of bizarre form that absolutely reflects where we are at the end of the 20th or the beginning of the 21st century. So our work is to decode that. Our work is to walk through those ruins and to understand sort of what these pieces are and how we navigate them and how we live with them, and how they're still in many ways charged with the kind of conceptual energy of past systems, whether those are cultural systems and ideologies, or those are kind of institutional and political systems as well. So they're there. So, when we talk about, issues today like institutional racism, or we talk about global food chain, these things are not just entities that have popped up in the moment, but they challenge us to understand how concepts aren't static things, but that concepts have a life, and they live and they transform through time on their own and through the influence of individuals, human beings, societies, and non-human actors as well, I would say. All sorts of things that ultimately present us with ever transformed conceptual material that we constantly are taking in and rethinking and reshaping.
No, that's really sort of fascinating, and one of the things that in a previous conversation with Lisa Heltke, we also talked about sort of this idea of hospitality, right? And one philosopher that came up there as well very briefly was Emmanuel Levinas, talking about sort of this otherness, right? And that's also sort of one philosopher that you discuss in the context of discussing how Nietzsche sort of transforms or provides sort of this transformation, and then maybe from that we can now also understand Levinas, another philosopher, how does he sort of, create this transformation? That would be really helpful.
Yeah, Levinas is, in a certain sense, famous. His claim to fame as a philosopher, he's known as the philosopher of the other, a philosopher of otherness, whether that's the absolute divine other or it's the other that we encounter in our daily lives. But at the core, so the kind of move that Levinas makes as a student of Heidegger is, if for Heidegger, the first philosophy is ontology, or the kind of remembering of the history of being. Levinas said, first philosophy is ethics. It's always about the encounter with the other. And this is I'm indebted a great deal to David Goldstein's essay from Gastronomica from a decade plus ago, I think, or maybe not quite that long ago, but his great essay where he kind of traces the role that food and eating plays in Levinas's philosophy throughout his works. I mean, so it's very central to his central work, Totality and Infinity, but it appears in other places as well. But for someone like Levinas, the act of eating is this ultimate encounter with the other, and we can trace all the trajectories, right? So there's this way in which something that is other than me will eventually become me. I metabolize it. It becomes part of my very physical being when I eat something. But there's also the act of sitting at a table across from another. So here we are, like all creatures, we need to feed and fuel ourselves, but we're also aware of the presence of that other at our table. And we're either in a relationship of sharing and kind of co-eating, or one is getting more than the other in some kind of way. There's a power down, or one is eating and one is not eating. So we're kind of always, so even when I eat in solitude, at home, I'm eating with others, because others around the world are eating or not eating because they don't have sufficient food. They're not able to get access to food in some way, but it's, but someone else provided that food for me. We're wrapped up in these kinds of systems. And of course, the act of sharing your food, literally, rather than ingesting that food, giving it to someone else. Yeah. That's sort of the ultimate act of connecting with the other. So there are these various ways that Levinas is able to trace this, and it's it becomes I think it's an underappreciated facet of his philosophy. The French thinker Corine Pelluchon just wrote a book. It's probably about 5 years old now, called Nourishment, and Levinas's phenomenological approach becomes hugely central to the way that she kind of rethinks ontology from through the form of nourishment. So it's a really fascinating work, really important work, I think, that was just recently translated into English. So that's also for those interested in food and philosophy. That's one I would highly, highly recommend. She's doing really, really great work.
And when we now look at sort of, we've been discussing Nietzsche quite a bit, and now just introduce sort of Levinas, and thinking about how food plays a role in sort of both of these philosophies. And here I might be sort of oversimplifying, but on the one hand, could I say, okay, from sort of a Nietzschean perspective, right? Like some people might say, like this individualistic sort of perspective that sort of manifests itself versus maybe more of the grounding from Levinas's perspective, which is actually about this sort of otherness. Right? Like, does that then also sort of set out two sort of different projects? Like, does that manifest itself, in sort of thinking about food in different ways, or would you just say like they're sort of complementary and they both help us, think about these questions?
Yeah, I'm glad you presented that, because I tend not to think. I write a lot about other thinkers, but it's not like I'm saying, how do I mix Levinas and Nietzsche? It's usually more about kind of currents and sort of concepts, but it's also really helpful in that way, because it's an odd pairing. Think of Nietzsche and Levinas in all sorts of ways. But so I think the first would be to ask, maybe, like, to what extent is Nietzsche's thinking open to the kind of otherness that Levinas presents us with? And that's kind of challenging, right? Like, we certainly know that Nietzsche's not really terribly shy about how he feels about things, and the degree of his correctness about some of those things. Although I think that comes across more as rhetorical flourish than kind of what his philosophy is actually saying. But it would be wrong to say that there's a kind of robust theory of the other dwelling somewhere hidden in Nietzsche's philosophy, that it's just not there. So we might ask, well, can these two things coexist with each other, or are there places where Nietzsche's, there are just going to be aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy that undermine Levinas's project, or vice versa? I think there are already examples of 20th century philosophers who have kind of worked in that general direction, we might say. So yes, but so for some, I mean, I'll just because he's central to my own, kind of background, but, thinking of someone like Gianni Vattimo. So he already makes this interesting move where he's sort of reading Heidegger through Nietzsche rather than reading Nietzsche through Heidegger, as would be the historical way to do it. So in a certain sense, he's trying to, what is oftentimes known as a kind of left reading of Heidegger, trying to, I think, make Heidegger less mystical and more anti-foundational and more of a critical thinker. So kind of pushing him back into that trajectory of Nietzsche, and I'll say also Kant kind of operating in this trajectory as well. But so someone like Nietzsche, we might then ask, okay, so who are the thinkers in the 20th century who are kind of working in an anti-foundational way that allows us, through that resistance of dogmatic and absolute truths, to be kind of more open to otherness. And there's a sense in which even Levinas doesn't quite get to that point, right? We wouldn't think of Levinas, even though he kind of opens up that door to thinking otherness. He's not a postmodern thinker in any kind of way. And so it's still tied to some claims that we might think fall more squarely into certainly into the phenomenological tradition, but maybe even be it before that in some sense. So, but there might also be other models out there for thinking otherness. So maybe it'd be right to say that Nietzsche allows us to think diversity and plurality, but maybe not otherness.
I see. And maybe moving a little bit to sort of this idea regarding interpretation. So you talk about this idea, cooking as interpretation, or I think in the talk I saw that you gave, you at one point I think also say cooking is interpretation, if I remember correctly. So maybe how should we understand this, cooking as interpretation, and why should we care?
Yeah, so this is one of those places where I've tried to merge my two research trajectories. Okay, so I think I'd mentioned philosophical hermeneutics already, but not really explained what it is. Hermeneutics is the theory of interpretation. Then philosophical hermeneutics is a way of thinking that not only focuses on the question of ontology, so what does it mean for things to exist or for things to be, but that the fundamental way that things exist and interact with each other is one that is better described by the concept of interpretation. So things, we might say, are co-involved and influence each other in various ways. So my understanding of the world around me is never just a God's eye view, where with some kind of objective or scientific gaze, I could just describe things as they are. The model is more like the experience we have, let's say, when we read a novel. So I know that when I read a novel, like I bring all of my baggage to that book. So I'm interpreting those words in a particular way that might be different than your experiences in the way that you would interpret that story or read that character or find joy or find sadness. And so there are differences among all of the readers in that text, and the author is there also present in the text in some way, kind of influencing us through the choices that the author has made. But we also know, and this is Gadamer's famous notion of the hermeneutic circle, that if a book I read when I was 15 years old, if I go back and I read that now, I'm going to read that differently, not just because I'm older at this point and I've had more experiences, but more importantly, because what's included in that experience is that first time that I read that book. So so that first experience with the book kind of comes back around in the circle, and both, so my older self is influencing that reading, but so too is the presence of my younger self having read that text. That is part of me as well. So,
I see.
There's this kind of back and forth that's there, or we could just think of the way that conversation and dialogue works. There's a push and pull that's there, or how, let's say jazz musicians who are improvising on the stage. There's a conversation going on, and when I hit a note or I, perform, a rhythmic expression or something like that, that might push a musician who's listening in a certain direction, but it's not as if he's just responding to an algorithm. Oh, okay, these notes have been played, so now I'm going to respond to that. It's active and it's open and it's ongoing. So I think we can use this model for cooking as well. And in that essay, I think that you read, I talk about sort of three fundamental principles of hermeneutics and how they might be kind of operative in the act of cooking. But I've been writing a lot about recipes lately because I'm interested in the conceptual form of recipes and how recipes are a kind of repository, not just of cultural memories and individual memories. We inherit recipes from our family members and things like that. But that the form of the recipe, whether it's a recipe that a chef at an industrial kitchen is using to produce the same thing every time, or it's a handwritten recipe that was passed down to you, or it's an Instagram video where someone's showing you how to make vegan pad thai or something like that. Like all of those kind of operate in similar but also in very distinct ways, and they have a kind of ideology that's operative behind them. So when we think about cooking, and whether you're kind of cooking and improvising in the kitchen, or if you're cooking from a recipe, interpretation, I think, is active. Because, if I'm going to say, okay, I just got some vegetables and now I'm going to use these as, make a stew with them or something like that. If I'm an accomplished cook to the degree that you might say I'm also accomplished or able to play an instrument, what I'm presented with isn't the same every time. And so my reaction as a cook or as a reader or as a musician is going to change to fit those circumstances. So let's say I'm going to make a blueberry cobbler, okay? I'm actually thinking about making one this weekend for the holiday weekend. Now, I have a couple of recipes that I've seen. I have a general sense I've made it before. I know how to do this. And a lot of what's going to determine how much sugar I put in that recipe is how sweet the blueberries are when I get them. So now it's good. It's the season for blueberries, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is when I go at a farmer's market or somewhere and I buy blueberries, I'm going to taste them. And if they're extremely sweet because they've been picked at the peak of ripeness, then I know, like, okay, I've used this recipe before. Maybe I need to back off that sugar in some way because there's enough natural sweetness that's there. Or if I know that the people who are coming over and are going to enjoy this cobbler, like me, don't have much of a sweet tooth and prefer things to be a little bit more tart rather than sweet, then once again, I'm making these decisions along the way. So there's the way in which the kind of practical aspect of cooking is one that's interpretive rather than just, following a recipe or following a script or just, following directions from somewhere else. But I'll push it a little bit further as well and say that, cooking is a kind of interpretation because it's also transformative. And so, what happens when we take ingredients and we transform them into a particular dish in some way? So it's as if I'm, when I think about, so I'll go back to the idea of reading a book. So when I have the experience of reading a book, in a phenomenological sense, that whole experience, the book, me, my life after reading that book, things have been transformed in some way. And that book, in a certain sense, is no longer what it was. I mean, it's still the exact same words on the page that was there, before I had it. However, in my interaction with that book, that book is never the same thing to me again. In the same way that when I cook those dishes, that dishes is transformed in some way from its ingredients. But also we might say that every time I make that dish, every time I make that favorite thing that I make, it becomes a part of this ever-growing and ever-stretching history of that thing in some way.
And it is very interesting. And now I'm trying to put some puzzle pieces in my head together, namely, what we just talked about, sort of this ideas, interpretation, right? Sort of as an ongoing, always evolving task. Like, how does that relate back to, going back to this idea of taste and equality, right? Like, is this taste, very much connected, right? That they sort of come as a package. Okay, we have, taste as a model of knowing, and now interpretation, just fits into that specifically, or are they more like separate parts, or, how should?
Yeah, so I think in one basic way, when we think of the experience of taste, right, and not just, what's happening on your tongue, at a biochemical level, but the entire experience, which is physiological, cognitive, social, we've all had the experience where you can be eating your favorite food, but if you're eating it next to the person who you loathe that doesn't taste quite as good, you're like, oh, great. That the environment influences all sorts of, there's been lots of psychological experiments about music playing and smells in the room and how it impacts the way that we taste things. So when we think broadly about the kinds of experiences that we have, so when I use that idea of taste as this sort of starting point for thinking about equality, for thinking about democracy, it's absolutely within that model of interpretation. So I would say that for us, tasting and the experience of taste is one that is interpretive through and through, precisely because it's never simply an objective apprehension of the thing that's outside of it, nor is it merely a subjective, I like this or I don't like that, because the thing that's outside of me is also influencing me and being influenced. So it's never just simply me liking the things that I like. There are things that are influencing my taste. There are things that are actively going on that are constantly pushing and pulling that experience in various directions. So, and then when we think about how we sort of navigate that mindset or that worldview with others, I think once again, the model of interpretation is important to understand that, like, if we disagree on a certain policy, if we disagree on how children should be educated or all sorts of other issues, to understand that what we're going for, what we're aiming for is not an absolute truth that solves it one way or the other or some perfect compromise, but that what we end up with is always going to be an interpretation. And just like that book that'll change when we reread it again, that critical return to it. So we know that's an interpretation, so it warrants our constant maintenance. And no one wants to hear this. No one wants to hear that what is going to be the end result of all of our hard work trying to come to some sort of agreement that's an interpretive truth. It's going to be more interpretation and more work, that because conditions on the ground are going to change. This is what we get from Nietzsche. This is what we get from Heraclitus. It's not as if we solve the problem and then everything ceases and the world stops spinning. And conditions are constantly changing by our efforts and by efforts that are well beyond our control. And so we have to be, aware of the kinds of things that have those impacts and then adjusting accordingly. I mean, we just look at, so many changes that have occurred, even just in the past couple of decades, whether it's our, I won't say awareness. I mean, I think we've been aware for longer than that, but the sort of urgency of climate crises, and then its impacts on migration and the food system and all those sorts of things. Like these are things that are not going to be solved in a way that we won't have to return to them again. They will require our constant maintenance, either because things will continue to get worse, or, if we are lucky enough to emerge from something like a climate change crisis, like in a positive way, we will be transformed by this. I mean, there's no way that the deepest nooks and crannies of our social, cultural, and political systems don't get transformed when we get rid of fossil fuels. We start to think of a more equitable, food system. We minimize, if not completely eliminate, animals as a food source. Those things down the line will have massive, massive impacts on just the way that we understand who we are as a species. And that will be a time when, all along the way, we'll have to be revisiting these questions. So sadly, it always ends up being like my classroom. Nothing's ever solved. There's always more work. This is
that's also the fun, right? But one other thing that I wanted to pick up on was when you talked about interpretation, right, and how it relates to, for example, thinking about recipes, and like basically pulling that into sort of maybe thinking about like epistemology. So, when we think about, for example, again, on this model of interpretation, the question is kind of like, what do we see as knowledge, right? Or like knowing how to make a specific recipe. And then we might be thinking in sort of classic epistemological terms, like, knowing how or knowing that distinction, or maybe here, like sort of participatory knowing gets into the picture, and what some other philosophers have been using. Like, how do we think about that sort of idea of knowledge then in the context of sort of interpretation, and then how that would relate to recipes?
Yeah, so within the I'd say second half of the 20th century, so when we think of hermeneutic philosophy, there's really three figures who stand out. There's Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German philosopher who's kind of masterwork Truth and Method, and from 1960 kind of sets the stage for what we might call a kind of hyper historically aware notion of interpretive truth that begins with the question of being, and that's the influence of Heidegger on him. And then you have the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who famously kind of argues like, well, we can't start with ontology. We can't start with the question of being. We start with epistemology. And we actually, from our ways of knowing, we can start to maybe get to the point where we can ask, what does it mean for this thing to exist? And then you have the Italian philosopher Luigi Parazin, the least known of the three, who kind of approaches the question, I would say, in a slightly different way. He's working out of a kind of existentialist and personalistic tradition. So it really has to do with what does it mean to live a human life on this model of interpretation. So here, someone like Paul Ricoeur is somewhat helpful, because he is asking those questions of the different ways that we know, and we can think at the root of the act of cooking. So there's a way in which I can know a recipe, right? So I know how to make a chocolate cake, or I know how to make pasta with clams or something like that, and I might have a recipe that I have memorized, or that I've got it in a book or in a box, and I can take it out and I can follow the recipe. So there's a kind of know-how that comes with the recipe, and it's a kind of following instructions, right? And so if I'm like have a decent facility in the kitchen, there might be something I've never cooked before. But if the recipe is written properly, the knowledge in the recipe has been conveyed in a clear and concise way, following the conventions of recipes, I should be able to produce that dish. But there's a piece that's missing. So this is what fascinates me about recipes. Number one, I think recipes hide more knowledge than they actually expose. Okay. So recipes primarily speak through absent. What's absent in a recipe? Pretty much everything that you need, right? There's never any talk about the stove and how to turn on the stove, how to manage a stove, and all this. Whether it was an early technology where you're using wood or coal to fire a stove, or a kind of modern stove that we would use today. The kind of cultural conditions, a lot of times, like within a basic recipe, when and why you would eat a certain dish, whether it has to go with the holiday or not. Now, a lot of times in cookbooks, you'll get part of the story of the recipe that comes with it as well. So sometimes it'll be a part of it, but a lot of times it's not there. And a lot of times people just want, like, your internet searching, how do I make this? I've got a dinner party in half an hour. And so you're trying to, just get the list of ingredients and the steps of the process, and that's it in some way. And all of the moves that you make in the kitchen while you're cooking, so your knife skills, understanding how to measure things properly, understanding how to set, to cook in an efficient way, to not be wasteful. All these things that you maybe learn from a parent or someone who cooked for you, or that you get trained for in some way. But there is a host of activity that's not there in the recipe. So and you see this when, I've taken students on study abroad trips to Italy a couple of times. And, they live in their apartments, or for them, a lot of times they have this double bind where, like, not only have they never cooked on their own before, but they're now navigating a supermarket or a food space that's not familiar to them. So they don't know the language. They're trying to find the ingredients they want. Yeah, they're caught, right? Because they might have an idea of how to make American type foods, but they're not finding the ingredients they need, even though it'd be much easier to make some Italian dishes because all the ingredients are there, but they're not familiar with how to do it. Mm. But in the case where the student has never cooked before, a recipe is almost meaningless. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times there'll just be some fundamental things like boiling water to make pasta. Now it might be on the side of the box, but just some of those, how much water to put in the pot, things like that. Sometimes they're in the recipes, but a lot of times those basic skills aren't there. So there's all of that that's there, that there is the recipe. But the real key piece of knowledge, how do you know when you've produced the dish? Sometimes the cookbook might have a picture of it, or maybe you've had it before, so you know what it should look like. But our savoring of the food, and I say savoring because at the root of that word, right, is sapere and sapore in Italian. These two words are closely linked. That taste is at the root, both of the word for knowledge etymologically and for taste. So this fundamental and primary way of knowing, one that's been, as Kurzweil tells us, dismissed by the history of philosophy as a way of knowing, is tasting. And ask any professional chef, as they're preparing a dish, they're constantly tasting. They're constantly monitoring, kind of, are they getting to the target of what their memory or what their training is telling them this dish should taste like? Because it might be different every time. The tomatoes might be more acidic. They might have used a different brand of some ingredient because the other one wasn't available. And so that they're constantly tasting and adjusting to make it. So that kind of knowledge, and one that's gained through a lot of experience and tied into our memories, that's one that is hard to teach, and is oftentimes one that one has to live in a certain way. So to think of knowledge that's not just this kind of abstract idea or this kind of storehouse of stuff that's in here, but that's experiential in a way. Cooking teaches us that very much, and that's not there in the recipe at all. The recipe lives in the world of that kind of taste and knowledge.
That's very interesting. So in some sense, if I understand it correctly, which might not be the case, like in some sense, like the recipe is per definition flawed because it doesn't or it cannot reach into sort of the experiential realm, or is that sort of a wrong way of putting it?
It's sort of, I think there are a number of models we can use in the history of philosophy. So I wouldn't say that it's flawed. There are certainly bad recipes that exist that were just not tested and that won't produce the thing they're claiming to produce. So it's not flawed. It's, we just have to understand its kind of proper limits. So the modern recipe, as we understand it, because recipes have existed throughout history. Sometimes they're just lists. Sometimes there's poems from the Middle Ages, talking about how to concoct this dish or to make this spell and things of that nature. But the modern recipe, where you have a list of standardized measured ingredients and then a set of procedures kind of leading you through how to do it, and procedures that are going to use kind of terminology that you have to be aware of, right? So if it might say saute for 10 minutes, but if you don't know what saute means, you're gonna be at a loss of the technique that you need that's there. So a good recipe is one that's going to have all of the ingredients you need to produce that dish and all the instructions that are there. But still, even a really good recipe in that technical sense, Andrea Borghini, who's a philosopher who works out of the University of Milan, he's written a bit on recipes as well. And, he talks about, the relationship between the recipe and the dish. So if the dish is like, let's say, a classic pizza margherita from Italy, and there's a recipe on how to produce that. And of course, the Italian government has official recipe like that, what will qualify as a pizza margherita. But, the recipe is not the dish, and the dish is not the recipe. The dish is the thing that's produced. Yep. And so what then is the recipe? Is the recipe a kind of representation of the dish? Well, a picture of the dish would be a kind of representation. So it's sort of a representation. It's sort of like a how-to manual for a set of techniques in order to produce it in some way, but it's never the food itself. So it's ontologically different than the dish or the food that itself, but it's also, maybe we can just say it's not complete. It's It's a set of indications that will lead us towards the creation of that dish, but it's never enough in order to do it. So you might say, is this recipe enough to make this dish? And I follow the recipe and I cook the dish. In a way, you can say, yes, that recipe was perfectly fine for making that dish, but that doesn't account for all of my experience, all of the knowledge that I brought to the cooking process in some way.
I see.
It's also helpful to think about the history of recipes, or at least the history of the recipes have existed probably for all of human history. I had written the editor's letter to the issue of Gastronomica from last summer when we centered on COVID stories at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I was just beginning to think about recipes at that point. So my introduction to that issue was recipe themed. So recipes have existed for as long as humans have been around. I like to think of them as a sort of the original meme in a way, because they take on a life of their own, that they exist sort of independently from us, and they're kind of artifacts that can transform over time, and they carry cultural information and taken up in different contexts, they'll be read. You just think of the life of a recipe that immigrates to a new place with a group of people, and how that recipe transforms because they're finding new ingredients, or the conditions are different in some way, and they're enacting it. But when we think of the history of the term recipe as we know it, it evolves in this 15th and 16th century, and it begins with medical receipts, medical prescriptions, basically. And so it's interesting to think about how this modern notion of the recipe begins with the idea that someone is ill, or someone is in some way lacking something, and the recipe is what will fix things. So it kind of is what gets us back to a state of being whole again, or well again. So this is kind of one aspect of the modern recipe that I think is interesting, because it's in a context where it's addressing a lack, or something that's not quite right. The other piece is that, the recipe is the imperative form. Take this, do that, do this other thing. But it's not directed towards the patient. So if you're the patient, I say, well, take 2 of these and call me in the morning. It's not directed towards the patient. The recipe's commands were actually directed towards the person who was given the recipe, so they could administer it to someone else farther away. So this is where we get back to that epistemological question again, because what happens? There's some expert, some doctor who has this knowledge, and the doctor can't get to everyone. Why? Because there's probably a plague or a pandemic, and there are too many people ill. So can that doctor take the knowledge that he has and make it portable? So that someone else could follow the instructions and give that medicine to the sick person? So recipes are about transmitting knowledge at a distance. So they're a delivery system for transmitting knowledge where the expert can't be. And we see this today, right? I'm not a chef, but I can go online and I can watch a video by a famous chef, or I can find so-and-so's recipe, and that transmits that knowledge into another realm. Now, of course, does it mean that the recipe is going to turn out properly? Not now. We know there are lots of times when it does, like we mess up and we can't cook the thing that we want to cook. And I imagine too that there were some medical recipes that probably were south also. But seeing it as a kind of delivery system for knowledge kind of shows us the extent of its reach, but also its limitations as a form. And if the recipe takes on a life that's not primarily a transmission of knowledge, but maybe for cultural celebration, for remembrance, and we do have recipes that operate in that way as well, then they have a kind of different ontological cast to them at that point. So think of recipes in this full sense of operating as transmitters of knowledge. I think that's the primary form they take within their modern realm. So we can think, there's lots of really good work in food studies about, let's say in the United States, for example, how immigrant populations that were new to the country were going to be quickly assimilated into American culture, what we might call kind of white normative Western European culture in some way. And one of the ways that this was done was through cookbooks and through the transmission of recipes that oftentimes came with the commercial products themselves. So here's how to use this ingredient to make this dish. And of course, those dishes were, normalized forms of dishes that might be familiar to those groups, but we're going to move them quickly, not just into American cultural life, but also into the American industrial agro system and the kinds of highly processed foods and also highly processed ingredients that go into those foods. So like Aaron Bobrow-Strain's great work on white bread, for example, kind of shows that trajectory and how, the history of kind of taking the germ out of, the wheat germ out of it so you can make a more shelf-stable white flour product is one that then becomes central to the kind of whitening of American society. And that's a really important work and really shows just how, food gets tied into our political mechanisms and our cultural mechanisms. And food is never just simply food. It always has this kind of powerful shaping effect on us.
That's really fascinating, and sort of picking up on what you mentioned regarding sort of recipes transmitting knowledge, and what I'm going to say is a bit speculative, mostly speculative in the sense of like sort of so sometimes it's also said, right, like food is also a risky enterprise, right? Like, it can also be deadly, right? So in that sense, in sort of a historical sense, like recipes might be sort of risk reduction. I'm not saying that actually is how it was, but like that would seem to sort of fit that way of understanding the function of recipes in the context of this is a risky enterprise as well.
Oh, absolutely, because taking a food, there's trust is one of the ideas that is absolutely operative in our food system at all times, right? And there are different ways that trust gets brokered, either through the familiarity of commercial products, through the familiarity with the person who just cooked you the meal or the farmer who provided it. But for the most part, in the modern food system, we're flying blind all the time, not in the sense that it's risky, but I would say that your average consumer is not aware of just how much work is going into keeping our food system safe all of the time, either through individuals who are actively doing that or through policies that have been built up over time. And it doesn't mean that there still aren't real flaws in the food system and real safety concerns that are out there. We have an incredibly, it's one of the miracles of the globalized world is just how safe and secure, how this is one of the problems too, how mindlessly someone who lives in a place like I do in the United States, how mindlessly I can eat and not have to worry about that food system for the most part, as compared to other times and places, either in the past or today in other parts of the world. But yeah, a recipe is definitely one of those transmitters of trust. Recipe comes from a reliable source, or a recipe just sort of leads us through the process, either so we don't harm ourselves by making something that can sicken us. So indications about how to safely handle poultry, indications about how to safely cook things to the right temperature so that they're food safe and so that we don't harm ourselves with pathogens. Those are oftentimes real so think of a recipe where you're making a custard and you're going to cook the eggs to 165 degrees Fahrenheit so that you don't have to worry about any pathogens that might be there in the eggs or something like that if you're concerned about eating raw egg yolks. So those kinds of things certainly help us. But they also help, in a lesser way, keep us from making hopefully disgusting things or things that we wouldn't like, right? So there's that kind of spectrum from what disgusts us to what can really harm us in some sort of way. So, I think you're absolutely right on that. Part of that transmission of knowledge is also transmission of trust, right? So if the prescription you get from the pharmacist has the pharmacist's name and the address of the pharmacy and all that, okay, good. That gives me some trust, rather than it's just a scrap of paper that someone wrote out, or you get some pills from some guy in the corner. These would be higher degrees of risk, let's say, involved in our use recipes.
Yeah, certainly. And taking this, idea of gastronomy, you also discuss the sort of topic of, or the perspective, I guess, of the sort of biopolitical understanding of gastronomy, where, how do we understand that biopolitics, and then how does that relate to gastronomy?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an idea that comes out of Foucault's work in the late 70s. And, so I think kind of broadly, when we think about, biopolitics, it's, we can think about what happens when when human biology or the human species as a whole becomes an object or central to kind of a political strategy. Whether it's an overt political strategy or it's sometimes perhaps unintended consequences that just come from the size and the complexity of our global food systems. But, so as we see the rise of the modern world and the ability not just to think about humanity as a species at the global level, but also to influence and impact their biology. So everything from questions of birth to death in that span to the day-to-day sort of way that we live our lives and the impact that we have on our health, on our body chemistry, and all those sorts of things. So I had mentioned earlier that essay by Aaron Bobo-Strain on white bread politics. So he uses that figure of biopolitics as a central one. This is a way that American society was able to politically shape the kind of cultural life of the country through the biological practice of how it was going to feed that population, and a population that was demanding more stable food supplies. But of course, today when we think about all the issues of food security that arose through the pandemic, we understand very quickly how our policies towards pandemic management and testing and all those things immediately have impacts on our food chain and our food supply, and that those things are kind of intricately combined with each other. So I think early on, when I started to get interested in food, I was thinking about the biopolitical work of Giorgio Agamben and thinking about questions of genetically modified organisms in that way. But I think more broadly, it's an interesting topic when we think about how our sort of industrialized global food system has an impact on the biology and the bodies of human beings, and the possibility of sustaining human life, and how choices, so a very direct way we think about how my individual choices or anyone's individual choices about the foods that they eat on a daily basis supports and has an impact on a food system that has real powerful consequences, either through eating or in other ways, on entire populations of people. So you think about it, for example, how the global fishing industry not only has a massive impact on the sustainability of those fish stocks around the planet, but on the human toll that it takes. We know that there's an inordinate amount of human trafficking that goes on, and human slavery and indentured servitude that's involved in a lot of the fishing industry around the globe. And that's something that doesn't show up in my supermarket when I see a fish that's there, but in many ways that by buying those products, I am indirectly supporting those systems that are having a real toll on human lives who are fishing those things, on the villages that are living, in the shadow of those massive processing plants where they're processing fish into protein powder, into pet food, into other sorts of things. So there are all those impacts about. So, I mean, the best work that's being done, I would say, in the realm of biopolitics and food comes out of people in food studies who are working in anthropology and sociology, but also in geography. And geographers seem to be really keen on Foucault and really keen on understanding how food systems on a global scale have that kind of impact. So those are good places for people to track down really good stuff there.
No, that's really helpful. And then, we've discussed the sense of taste and then how that might relate to building some notion of equality. And then in this sort of framework, like this biopolitical framework, you also talk about how this sense of taste, right, which you say, is our side, right, for subjective preference, can also serve as the political foundation for democratic coexistence. And sort of thinking that through what I was sort of just doing, one thing that sort of comes to mind, right, is going back to this terminology of, getting a seat at the table, right, which might very much align, I guess, with sort of this democratic ideal, right, where each person, has their vote. But on the other hand, I'm thinking then, like in the democracy, right, where we do get a sense of maybe representative democracy or, majority rules sort of idea, then that also seems to fade away again in this idea of democracy. Like, do you think that's sort of a strange interpretation by me, or do you think there's something there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, so as I've tried to think through this idea, and once again, this is an idea that I think there have been a couple of essays where I always seem to end up at that idea, and then the question is, where do I develop this, or how does this develop, or does this, so does this merely operate as a kind of regulative ideal that is helpful when thinking about ethics? So, it might be a good thought experiment to begin with, to say, what if we thought about our social and political lives as modeled on the way that we would like to run a really inclusive table for others? Mm-hmm. And so what would be active there? So we'd be actively thinking about not just who's at the table, and importantly, who's missing from the table, who we need to invite, but then also, there are kind of biological and physiological concerns, right? So if I have people over to my house that I'm serving dinner, I'm going to think, well, what do people eat? Does someone have a food allergy? Does someone have, ethical concerns about the consumption of certain products? Those are things that, so you mentioned the idea of hospitality before, coming out of Lisa Helke's work. So when I want to be a good host, I want to be hospitable towards my guests, that always seems to be one of the most direct ways, not just to be accommodating to my guests, but particularly if I have people who I haven't met before, who I'm going to be serving, or I'm going to have as guests in my home. Like, there seems to be no better way to make a positive connection with them than to start off by saying, what can I do, or what can I avoid to make, because it's always uncomfortable when you're in a new situation. So how can I lower that anxiety? How can I make a connection with you before you even sit down at the table? Just to know that someone is kind enough or concerned enough to ask. Like, I think that's a good starting point, rather than sitting down and be like, welcome to this Shea Valgenti, like, this is how we're going to do it here. So I think being open to that is something that, well, what would happen if we expanded that to a larger model about how we coexist in a small community, in a town? So I think of like a town council meeting in a small town or village. Like, are the open meetings hospitable in that way? Or are they challenges for people who maybe haven't historically had their voices heard, or who might think that their perspective or their worldview isn't going to be viewed favorably by the ones there? Now, it might be a misplaced fear. Sometimes it's a warranted fear, but if it's a misplaced fear, sometimes just that gesture from the host, that you're welcome here, is enough to begin that conversation and to make people feel more empowered. I think that's part of it as well. So how do I want, if I have people at my table, I want them to enjoy themselves. I want them not just to be eating and meeting their caloric requirements for the day. I want them to enjoy their time, and there are lots of things you can do before you even sit down that help that enjoyment to some extent. Now, is that a model that can be expanded to entire nations or to the entire globe? Let's have that conversation. I think a good way to start is to think that the first step is not getting down to brass tacks, as they say, or like, okay, let's start to go. No, I mean, what we learned from diplomacy, there's been some good work on this, is that when diplomatic negotiations actually begin with a meal, they tend to go better. Because you make a connection with that other person who you might not know or might have hostilities towards, and you kind of build that common ground there. So it might be that it's certainly good for statecraft. It might be that it's a good way to think about diffusing tense situations, but certainly I understand your point. Like when we think, okay, well, how should we run a democracy?
Yeah.
Like if everyone like is it an abhorrent idea to think that everyone who is voting is going to vote their preferences? I mean, this is sort of the ideal. Like we have these discussions now when we're talking about voter reform, and there's lots of backlash from the last election in the United States, where mostly Republican-led states are passing legislation that's restricting access to voting. Shouldn't the goal be 100% turnout?
Yeah.
And everyone voting truly how they want to vote? Now, once again, we run into that problem where I might say, oh my gosh, no, like I don't want, that person, with their views, who thinks everyone should own guns and be armed to the teeth, like those views are challenging to mine. But what am I doing to change that person's mind? What am I doing to create the conditions where people don't feel that they need to, be totally armed in order to survive within American society or feel safe within American society? Or what am I doing to create the conditions for more open dialogue about what an inclusive society looks like? I think that's the challenge where, everyone, myself, first and foremost, there's more work to be done, as I mentioned earlier. So the idea that everyone votes their preference and everyone gets to weigh in this kind of like absolutely pluralistic democracy, I think many people feel frightened, can feel frightened by this idea, but that's assuming that people's viewpoints are unchanging and unchangeable. I think the more that we understand the material conditions and the social conditions that make people think the way that they do, the more that we if someone has fears about, others in society, we need to ask that question: is what are we doing to understand why that person is thinking the way that they are? Because we certainly oftentimes have assumptions about that, but it might be that there are more commonalities there ultimately than differences. But to go back to the recipe, there's no recipe for the simple solution, and that's why I think the recipe is an interesting and perhaps somewhat challenging form, because we use that expression all the time. Like, isn't there just a simple recipe to get from point A to point B and solve our problem?
Yeah,
maybe not.
Yeah.
So I can't answer that. Like, is this a good model for democracy? It might be horrible. At the end of the day. But I think if at the end of the day, everyone sits down at the table, has a good time, and feels like they're welcome, that's not a bad place to begin that discussion. And there's certainly more of that, the kind of, the way that we talk about this sort of splitting of the American public into two, the divided, we've seen this mirrored in populist movements in other places around the globe. But there's certainly, as the temperature in the room gets a lot higher in terms of the sort of stakes of these discussions, and of course, all the tensions of climate crisis and wealth inequality, all those kinds of things exacerbate it. Yeah, there's a real need to lower the temperature in the room and to kind of think, where are the places where we can find commonality? Yeah. And so if the question is, in the United States context, like, how are we going to mend this divided country? The place to start is where we have common ground. And that common ground might simply be that, what I really like to eat, what you really like to eat, let's sit down, have those things and talk about it. And we can do that as long as we exist in conditions of relative abundance and access.
Yeah.
I think there are other challenges that emerge when we don't have those conditions. So I think this entire conversation, I'm certainly mindful of the fact that it both originates from and operates within a context, where there's some level of comfort and access. And that's not always the case, certainly. But it's certainly something, I think that should be the goal to create.
Yeah. No, this is, very interesting. Lots to think about for everyone, I think. And sort of maybe looking sort of towards the future, right? So like, in your view, your perspective, like what are some of the exciting topics within maybe the philosophy of food, or maybe also where you think philosophy of food can help other areas of philosophy a lot more? They should be paying a lot more attention. Like, that would be interesting.
You've diagnosed my problem, which is that there are constantly things that I get interested in that sort of drag me away from actually getting good work done, and kind of taking sort of what we've been talking about today and putting it into thinking it through completely, and then putting it into some kind of larger, more coherent work. So I've had this idea. I mean, so in that realm of interpretation. So recently, I've been working a lot on the question of improvisation as well, writing on artistic and musical improvisation, which is also something that I'm fascinated in, and also something that's central to cooking as well. Like so. Great cooks who cook without recipes and are improvising in the kitchen, or go to the farmer's market and say, oh, there's this here today and that thing, and I can sort of improvise what will be the dish and write it on the chalkboard. Those kinds of things to me are fascinating. So the kinds of kind of operative knowledge that's in place when someone is able to improvise, that's really fascinating. So that's really deep into that flow, that Heraclitean and Nietzschean flow of things. So I think it's so interpretation and improvisation to me are go sort of hand in hand as well. So that's one. And this is also related to the question, something that I've not really thought much about, but would be a great avenue for someone to do work on, is in artificial intelligence. We know that there's work being done in artificial intelligence along the lines of tasting. So we create kind of mechanical and what would be the word, algorithmic forms of kind of tasting mechanisms, and this could serve all sorts of functions, obviously, and perhaps be more sensitive than humans can be, as AI is oftentimes doing the kinds of calculations and cognitive operations that are just too complex for us to do in any kind of timely fashion. But this deeper ontological question comes up there. So if everything that I and the other philosophers of food, if I can lump all of your other guests into this category and others who haven't appeared here as well into this category, if everything that we're saying generally is correct, okay, and that philosophy needs to pay more attention to food and to gastronomy and to acts of eating and food preparation, and that these aren't just objects of interest for philosophers, but they will also, thinking about them and thinking through them will also shape and change the way that we utilize the very concepts of philosophy. And so philosophy will transform and be better for having thought about what it had ignored for so long. Well, then what does it mean to then encounter or create an intelligence that doesn't eat?
Okay.
So if eating and the act of eating and all of the kind of phenomenological richness that comes with that is essential to being human. So when we create an artificial intelligence that has human-like intelligence or even superhuman intelligence in some way, what does it mean for that entity, for that mind even, to not ever have the experience of eating?
I see.
And not have a body in which it metabolizes things. And this is a thought that I had recently, but I haven't, thought through in any sort of systematic way. But would be really, would that be freeing? Would that, so what would it mean to have a conversation as intellectual equals with a being that has no metabolism?
I see.
That doesn't have to ingest, that only thinks of sustenance in terms of the electricity that keeps its systems running in some way. And for us to live, to have formed, in an evolutionary way, and thus have it shape our the structures of our thinking to some extent, to come from a status where like providing food at one point in human history, or might, and for some still does, takes up every ounce of your energy throughout the day. So your thinking is directed primarily towards procuring your next meal, just to keep that process of keep that process of living going on in some way. And then, of course, once you get to a point where as humans and as societies, we can ease back on that and create leisure time, and then also create food and food ways that are not tied to sustenance, but tied to ritual and tied to pleasure and tied to all sorts of other things. This becomes really central to who we are as beings. And what does it mean to coexist with a sentient mind, if artificial intelligence gets to that point, for whom that is not a concern and for whom that is not an issue? And of course, the idea of taking our consciousness and placing it into a cybernetic organism, right? So when we think of questions of post-humanity as well, one of the things perhaps that we take offline is the need to eat. And is our, would it be like the kind of thing where like we still want to like create some mechanisms whereby we can have the experience of tasting food or eating food because that's what it means to be human in some way? Or does food just become this empty signifier because we no longer need it? Does it fall away from the human experience? So there are all those kinds of questions.
No, that's really fascinating.
Yeah, because obviously in terms of the survival, like, so once again, we're seeing this is where we return to those ancient Greek questions, right? If the goal is the survival of the human, if we go with the idea that being human is more of a product of consciousness than being physiological human, so then the post-human question of, okay, take our consciousness and put it into a cybernetic body that doesn't die, in 70 to 100 years, that doesn't need to be constantly fueled, in the way that a human body does. Get rid of all this is what the Greeks wanted to do, right? Get rid of all the bodily problems and just be a mind. And then once you're just that mind, we don't need our food system anymore, which is one of the primary drivers of the climate crisis. So think of so in one way, all of these problems at least potentially get solved, right? But of course, that utopia is also the dystopia, right? Because are we, that's the post-human question. Are we even human at that point? Number one, is the human experience really to be embodied and to be tied to this mechanism, which is from its birth constantly changing and ultimately failing and falling apart? And then, of course, all the wonderful things that come with food. So think of the taste that you enjoy the most, or the meal that you, with company of others that you enjoy the most, and how essential that is to being human, and what it means to be human, and how that would change if you were all mind. This is, I always challenge my students with this question about, when we read Plato, and Phaedo, and questions of the soul living on and what the afterlife is like. And, if living as just a soul or just a mind means no longer having a body, then what would it mean as a thought experiment to think through stripping away all of the kinds of cognitions we have that are tied to bodily experiences? And this is what it means to really take someone like Plato seriously. When Socrates tells us that we have to, that philosophy is practice for dying and death, what we're doing is we're preparing the soul to no longer be tied to the body. And that's easy just to kind of, we think of the afterlife as like, oh, like I can pick my 20-year-old body and we're just doing all the fun things we like to do. And it's like, all that's gone. I don't even know what it means to be a mind. And I, in a certain sense, I don't think that's a realistic idea to think about. because my mind is part of these biochemical processes that are tied to my neurological system. Consciousness is this kind of epiphenomenon that's created. And to think of consciousness and the life of the mind without the body to a certain extent is silly.
Yeah.
It's a silly question. Because, you know, I only know of my mind through this body.
Yeah. Although, like, so it could be a use for exercise in the sense of, okay, but what if we take it away? What does that tell us about food, eating?
It's a useful exercise, mainly to frighten the children. You know, it's to make them think you thought the afterlife was going to be great. If it does exist, it's not even going to be horrible. It's just going to be bizarre, and you are totally not going to be prepared for it because you love your body so much, or you love the things that your body gives you access to.
I see. I think this is a great place to end. Everyone is frightened, so that's a great way to end this.
It always ends up happening, and I apologize.
No worries. So, Professor Valgenti, this was amazing. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show.